Welcome back, everybody. Here is my beautiful assistant, my projector. You can see that we are in my basement getting all this stuff ready for my journey off. Has been a little overwhelming, so sorry about the sort of jumping around and continuity errors and stuff, but hopefully it makes it, I don't know, more interesting. Maybe this time we can throw in some Dora the Explorer references. That was an in-joke, sorry. Let's do Sigmund Freud. So the value of doing this is not that it's all true, because Freud is taught as a sort of historical example in psychology courses nowadays rather than as real psychology, right? But at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Freud really was cutting edge and new and exciting. So from that perspective, it's deserving of respect as something that has been foundational to knowledge now, even if it's not seen as accurate in 2019. But it also means it's been hugely influential in the ways that we think about our brains. I guess with psychology it would be minds, perhaps, in this stage. But it's been hugely influential in terms of cultural depictions of psychology. And when we looked at The Raven on Monday, and when we look at Doctor Who on Friday, you'll see that a lot of Freud's observations seem fairly sound. The way to look at Freud, I think, for me at least, is as black box theory, where the black box is the mind or the brain, and Freud doesn't have any access to that. But what Freud does have access to is a plethora of case studies. His patients, he had a lot of them. So he managed to observe human behaviour and human explanations for that behaviour in extremis, day in and day out for decades. So he had a tremendous corpus of knowledge about human behaviour, and I think that's the context and the limit for how we should understand Freud. So I want to talk about Freud today because his essay on the Uncanny is really foundational for a lot of understanding of how culture frequently can be scary or unsettling. And it's fascinating because even though intrinsically Freud isn't current anymore, he seems right about a lot of things. So let's get into it. So Freud writes this essay on the Uncanny, and the first thing he says is that this isn't a typical psychology essay because he's talking about aesthetics, which psychologists, at least when Freud was writing this in 1919, rarely write about, which is great for us. We're studying culture in this first year course, so him talking about aesthetics and making that an explicit direction for his essay demonstrates the potential value of what he has to say about scariness and how it might translate over into culture. So he says, "It is only rarely that a psychologist feels impelled to investigate the subject of aesthetics, even when aesthetics is understood to mean not merely the theory of beauty, but the theory of the qualities of feeling." Not merely the theory of beauty, but the theory of the qualities of feeling. So that means what exactly makes up feelings that we have? You see, one of the things about the uncanny is that for Freud it is a feeling, this feeling of being unsettled, maybe in a slightly horrific way. And Freud does talk about this at length in the essay, and I won't get into it too much here. But Freud does say it's a debate, is this even a feeling? But given we have this term, unheimlich in German, or uncanny in English, we have this specific term for this thing which is so experiential, it's defined by having experienced it, and is something that so many of us can attest to, that unsettling feeling when you fear that something is under the bed or behind the door, and you feel it so strongly even though you know it can't be true. Freud says that this reaction is so defined by its experience and so universal that it seems reasonable to acknowledge it as a feeling. Now we're right in the purview of culture, of course, because culture, it almost has as its first raison d'etre to make us feel. So we can use the essay to talk about Edgar Allan Poe and other scary kinds of culture. So here is Freud's initial introduction to what characterises this feeling, so the quality of this feeling of the uncanny. The subject of the uncanny is a province of this kind. It undoubtedly belongs to all that is terrible, to all that arouses dread and creeping horror. It is equally certain, too, that the word is not always used in a clearly definable sense, so that it tends to coincide with whatever excites dread. Yet, we may expect that it implies some intrinsic quality which justifies the use of a special name. So that last part is what I was talking about when I introduced this idea, that the uncanny is something unique. It has some kind of intrinsic quality, some quality almost unique to itself that justifies using the special name. So it's not just whatever incites dread, it's something more than that. The uncanny does not equal dread. So look at the way in which Freud initially describes it. It's not just dread, it also belongs to all that is terrible, 1, all that arouses dread, 2, and creeping horror, 3. So you can see that the uncanny is more like a nexus of scary qualities. And that's something that I'm going to return to, because I think more than anything that's what justifies this unique term. It's a nexus of scary things. So all of those things in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, like associations with darkness and death and sleep and sort of depressive drugs and the wind and noises like tapping and this capability we have to scare ourselves with things we can say, and then we have a weird experience about, oh, I've just said something that almost came to me as though another person said it. Numerous other things. These things all coalesce in a nexus that is the sort of creeping dread at the core of the poem. And that in and of itself is a great starting way to think of the uncanny. But as we go through the lecture, we'll find out that Freud has some really specific examples of the uncanny, which are quite powerful and that I like a lot. So let's get to those. Okay, I'm simplifying almost to the extreme in this lecture, but I didn't want to make you read the essay without any context, so I'm just trying to summarise something you haven't read. Obviously feel free to go away and read it yourself if you're really interested in this, but hopefully I'm going to do a decent job. The problem is I'm not going to be able to do everything in the essay. So when Freud talks about the etymology of the uncanny, i.e. the sort of linguistic history of the uncanny, what he has to say is quite complex. So I'll start with this idea just to introduce to you the connection between the German and the English. But bear in mind this isn't all that Freud says. The German word unheimlich is obviously the opposite of heimlich, meaning familiar, native, belonging to the home. And we attempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar. Naturally, not everything which is new and unfamiliar is frightening. Did I get that quotation right? I'm not absolutely sure. Is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar? Yes, sorry, the grammar's a little strange. That just means unknown and unfamiliar, right? Naturally, not everything which is new and unfamiliar is frightening, however. The relation cannot be inverted, so everything that is familiar and known, that can also be scary, right? Things that are familiar and known can be scary. The relationship can't be inverted. We can only say that what is novel can easily become frightening and uncanny. Okay, so this beginning of this etymological process, it just describes unhomely is the like literal German translation, and so our equivalent, we wouldn't say unhomely, we'd say uncanny. But this root of unhomely is interesting because it has this sense of something which is unfamiliar, sort of unfamiliar in an almost deep-lived sense. The home isn't just some weird abstracted concept. The home is where the heart is. It's where you lay down your roots. You feel a deep connection and almost a deep reliance on the sense of home, whether it's a literal home in the sense of a house or a place where you live, but also a more sort of geographical home, say like Canada. So unheimlich, unhomely, might seem to be the opposite of that. But the interesting thing is that in the very word unheimlich, there remains that term homely, you see. So unhomely does sort of mean the opposite of homely. But because homely is still retained in the term, that indicates that there's still some vestiges of home there. And I won't really talk about this today, but that's something Freud actually goes on to say in the essay, is that if you follow along the various confusing, there are multiple definitions that are sometimes incongruent with each other, of unheimlich in the German. If you follow all these definitions through to their logical conclusion, what's actually the case with unheimlich is that what is heimlich and unheimlich can sort of blend into one another, that something heimlich can be in fact unheimlich, and vice versa. I know that sounds a bit weird, but I will unpack it in just a moment. But what I want to emphasize here is that unhomely doesn't just mean the opposite of home. It almost means something a bit more connected to the home. And so that means our sort of equivalent, the uncanny. Uncanniness tends to rely on some kind of familiarity in some way, but familiarity that has been tainted, or something that shouldn't be familiar at all. Something so scary and awful or horrifying or, I don't know, just disgusting, that somehow an artist manages to connect to something homely. That too can be uncanny, right? A terrifying, blood-sucking monster that looks like a human, a vampire. So the humanity in that is heimlich, homely. One of the things about Freud's essay, and one of the reasons I like it, is not because he's right about everything. He makes some claims about what other people say about the unheimlich and how they're wrong, but I actually quite like what those other people are saying. But that's precisely why I like the essay, you see, is Freud is introducing or collating some other people's attitudes towards the uncanny, so it's a great source text for a variety of people's opinions. So here are some remarks from Daniel Sanders that Freud quotes in the essay. Unheimlich, uneasy, eerie, blood-curdling, quote, seeming almost unheimlich and ghostly to him. I had already long since felt an unheimlich, even gruesome feeling. Feels an unheimlich horror. Unheimlich and motionless like a stone image. The unheimlich mist called hill fog. Unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained hidden and secret and has become visible. I mean, the uncanny is a great word, right? But and this articulates why it's such a great word. It can encompass all of these weird different circumstances that nevertheless draw out a very similar sense, a very similar feeling. But that's also why it's difficult to define. So this is, I think, it's Ernst Jentsch, the German psychologist from the early 20th century. Freud doesn't like what Jentsch has to say very much, okay? So that's the thing to admit here is, I like what Jensch has to say about the uncanny, and Freud doesn't. Freud disagrees. So that's why I'm quoting it here, is I think Jensch is kind of right. Jensch's best description of the uncanny is this. He speaks of doubts whether an apparently animate being is really alive, or conversely, whether a lifeless object might not, in fact, animate. So, you know, waxworks figures, artificial dolls and automatons, robots that look like humans, humans that act in a kind of robotic way, it can be freaky. So do you see what I mean about this interplay between the Heimlich and the Unheimlich? That a human, or an animal, is Heimlich, it's homely, it's familiar, we know what that thing is. But then when it acts in a way that's outside its box, outside its boundaries, you know, a human that normally moves in a quite sort of fluid, uninterrupted, organic way starts to operate in a kind of jerky, robotic way. That is unheimlich. It's something homely that has become outside itself, unfamiliar, unhomely. But similarly, a robot, something that's clearly a robot, that mimics human speech perfectly, say, or mimics human body language perfectly, that is something very much unhomely, a robot that is echoing homeliness, that's echoing familiarness, and that can be extremely uncanny too. So, something familiar that operates outside its bounds. Another guy that Freud talks about is Otto Rank, and this is sort of Freud's references to Rank's interest in the double, and I've quoted this at length because it's also a great opportunity to introduce the idea of the double. But for double, think Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the T-1000 in Terminator 2 that can touch you and then mimic your form. Otto Rank has gone into the connections the double has with reflections in mirrors, with shadows. Is this actually going to work? Yes. Give me 1 second.